the two biggest systems in our body that get affected by sleep issues are, in my opinion, the two biggest health crises that we face in the world, which are cardiovascular health and mental health. And sleep issues and sleep disorders play directly and correlate directly with both of these things. So the fact that we underestimate that at times is something that I think is something that we need to do something about.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Openly Human Show. My name is Devam. I'll be your host, and joining us today is Dr. Sam Kashani, board-certified sleep medicine doctor with UCLA Health and a clinical professor at the Geffin School of Medicine at UCLA. Apart from his affiliation with UCLA, Dr. Sam Kashani is also the current president of the California Sleep Society. And Sam, before we get into the science of sleep, I want to start our episodes by getting to know you. I want to understand your journey because I feel like when it comes to actually understanding the knowledge you have to share with us, it's important to build a relationship with the hows and whys you got to where you are today. So just like any other platform, Openly Human is a platform, but the difference is we want to make sure that you are as authentic as possible and your journey is relatable just by you being openly human. So did you always want to go into medicine?
Well, thank you so much for having me. First of all, I really appreciate the invitation and I'm happy to be here. And in terms of whether I always wanted to be a physician, I think, as a child, I definitely had the idea of being a doctor. I loved the idea of helping people. I loved the idea of being a fixture in the community that people can, look to for help in that regard. And that's just, like I said, an idea that was kind of floating in the back of my mind all throughout childhood and my early years. But when it came time to choose a major, and when I was in college and trying to figure out what direction to take towards a career, I actually fell in love with film and film production. So that ended up really stealing my heart at that moment in my life. And so I made my major film and television studies, and I got my bachelor's degree in cinema and television arts. So I had a very different career path before actually choosing medicine. And upon graduating from film school, I actually worked in the Hollywood industry for a major production company. Nice. And after a while of doing that, because I realized that making Xerox copies and getting coffee for movie producers wasn't that creative after all, I decided that I wanted to quit and go on my own and make my own films. And that's what I did. I started making short films, and I ended up getting into the documentary space, and I actually wrote, directed, and produced 3 different documentaries that I'm very proud of, and I was able to show at different international film festivals. I got to screen them on the BBC and got to ride the festival wave, so that was really nice. But one day I woke up a broke filmmaker and decided maybe that was the right time to go and pursue my original dream of becoming a doctor.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting that because film is just such out of left field, like going to medicine from film. So very interesting. Any funny stories that you have that, that came out of that film pathway that possibly, were like, uh-oh, I don't want to do that again. So
too many, gosh.
Yeah.
I will say this, that I'll share one experience from my filmmaking days. When I graduated film school, and was ready to just sort of go out into the world and start making films and creating films from scratch, I had the opportunity to visit my country of origin, which is actually Iran. I had never been there. I was born and raised here in the United States. I consider myself American, but my parents are from Iran. And so it wasn't until I graduated film school that I went to that country for the first time in my entire life. And when I was there, I told myself I'm going to take my camera equipment with me and my recording equipment with me and just kind of see what inspires me while I'm there and what kind of film I want to, get into making. I ended up making 3 films while I was there. And essentially what really inspired me to make those projects was, in the Western world, we have a very limited sort of image and perception of what's happening on that side of the world. Yeah. We see the news and we see all these kind of, this political chaos attached to that part of the world. And when I went there, I was, expecting to just see that, expecting to see political and social unrest and instability. And there was plenty of that there, that's for sure. But there was also another side to life in a country like Iran or life in the Middle East, the more ordinary side, a side where kids are walking around the streets of Iran wearing Kobe Bryant jerseys and playing on their iPads, and kids are listening to the same music that I listen to. And it was really that more humane and ordinary side of life in the Middle East and life in Iran that really captured my interest and attention. And so I made 3 films that essentially centered around that, around what life is really like in these countries, independent of the negative connotations and images that we associate.
So you were trying to capture both the good and the bad and find a fine balance between the two. So to create a better image for your culture and your
That's
your
absolutely
background,
correct. The one thing I will correct about that, though, I was really not interested in showing the bad because I feel like the bad is already what you see on the TV every time you hear about that part of the world. So the films that I was making was really zoning in on taking a completely apolitical and a-religious approach to just painting an ordinary positive side to what life is like there, because ultimately, aside from all the difficulties that people experience living in countries where religious dictatorship and oppression is the kind of overarching theme of daily life, like I said, it's just a regular, ordinary place with regular people that are just trying to live their life and eat the same foods and watch the same movies and enjoy the same things. And it was really that I was trying to depict in my work.
And at that time, you probably didn't know what you were experiencing in terms of like how it would help you out later when you became a doctor and you have to relate to people who are either immigrating or just came over, and you're like, oh, I can connect to you now because I've seen you in your norm.
Well said. I absolutely agree with that. And I think that applies to all of us. The more that we see of the world, the more well-rounded we become as human beings, not only in terms of life experience, but the way that we understand and interact with other people.
So when you were making those films over there and the documentaries, did you find any kind of pushback from the community there?
Yeah. So not so much the community as much as the government. And I hate to talk about this subject because it's touchy, and other Iranians and Iranian Americans will understand where I'm coming from with this. But the system of government in Iran is not the best. Like I said, it's a religious dictatorship. People live in an oppressed fashion. Rights, there really are no equal rights, and especially when it comes to male and female rights, but that's a whole other subject. But I did get a lot of pushback despite the fact that I did everything legally, because I made sure to go out of my way while I was there to get the proper filming permits and talk to all the proper and necessary people that I needed to in order to actually get this kind of film project running. And so thinking that I was going about it the appropriate way and the legal way, thinking that I was going to be headache-free in that approach, I was most certainly surprised in that regard, because I was arrested a couple of times while I was there trying to make these films, and my crime was just using a camera.
Oh, wow.
And of course, initially when they were harassing us, it was, you're a spy or you're coming from another country trying to do this and that and spread propaganda. And my only response to these authorities that were, detaining us was, I'm actually just trying to make a movie about the positive side of life in Iran and the ordinary and the normal side of life in Iran. But of course, they're not trying to hear that. So it was a lot of panic and anxiety until we were thankfully able to get out of those situations. One of them involved us actually being taken to an underground holding detention center, which you can imagine was not the most relaxed day of my life. It was scary. We had people harassing us and asking us all kinds of questions. Again, thankfully, we were able to get out of that situation. But I can tell you that it was a pretty scary experience, and I'm just lucky and thankful that it's over and I was able to make the films that I set my heart on making.
That flight home must have been like, oof. Alrighty. Well, no, that's a very interesting story. I mean, it shows that, sometimes the path you're on is filled with obstacles because you're meant to go on another path. And so now we're going to talk about now you've decided at this point, you've come back, you made your films, you want to go to med school, and you're changing your career trajectory. And now that you're a doctor, I wanted to ask you, how does it feel when you have to balance your inner passion of being a caregiver and that drive to provide efficient care to your patients, and having to exist in a world where the business of medicine is, at the forefront? So how do you balance those two and make sure you're providing efficient care, but you're also satisfying the needs of your career?
What a great question. I would say that the simple answer to that question is when you really, really love what you do, that balance is much more natural. and much more workable. A lot of people in medicine, as is the case with any other industry or area of expertise or professional type of work, they're not necessarily happy, or they're not necessarily, it's not this choice of profession wasn't necessarily their first, or it's not something that they're totally in love with. And we all know that unless you really love what you do, then it just becomes a job and it becomes miserable. Whereas when you really love what you do and you really enjoy what you do, I always liken it to being an athlete. There's so many things that we underestimate about professional athletes, all the different things that they have to go through, because we see them on a screen, just, putting balls in a basket or, making touchdowns or whatnot. But you don't see everything that goes on, behind closed doors in the world of, professional athletes. Yeah. Everything from the politics of these sports organizations to the news media and the way that it covers them, and so many other aspects of it. I'm sure that plenty of athletes don't like a lot of those things about what they do. But at the end of the day, once they get on the court or once they're on the field, everything else just disappears. And that's all that matters. And that's how I feel when I'm in a room with a patient. All the, extra business stuff and political stuff and all the other things attached to medicine that make it kind of a little bit less attractive, they all disappear in my mind once I'm in a room with a patient, because at that moment, that's all that matters, is just me taking care of that person.
See, I feel like, our viewers will be very thankful to hear that coming from someone like you. And that's the whole point of being openly human, right? Because it shows that, our doctors aren't just money-making productivity machines. They actually care for you. They're not there to just prescribe you pills or to put you through some procedures. They want to take care of you. And I know this because I used to work with you, and I would see you come in all excited, go in and see a patient. If the patient did well, you would come out excited. If the patient was, somewhat saddened because of the outcome, you would himself be empathetic enough to absorb that feeling and also be affected by it. So it just shows the humanity that sometimes people overlook, because all they see is that white coat and that big hospital, and it just means money. So, thank you for, keeping that passion alive within yourself.
I appreciate you saying that.
So we're actually going to now move into the core of our discussion today, which is sleep. So I'm sure everyone's waiting to get a lot of their questions answered, but we'll start off with something very simple. What is sleep? Is it actually as uneventful as it seems?
Great question. Until several decades ago, that's kind of how, within health or within medicine and science, how sleep was perceived, as this sort of quiet state that exists between two periods of wakefulness, or that quiet state that exists between wakefulness and death. When in fact, now we know so much more about sleep, and we know that it is an extremely active and dynamic state during which the body does a lot of its most necessary physiologic actions. There's so many different things that happen during sleep, and there are so many problems that can affect sleep that not only translate to nocturnal issues at night, but really the concern is daytime issues, right? Because people who suffer from sleep disorders, that suffering that we're talking about, it's really during the daytime. The problem may be occurring at nighttime, but when we're talking about how it affects their quality of life, how it affects their mood, how it affects the way that they perform, the way that they work, the way that they learn, the way that we process emotionally, a lot of these things rest heavily on sleep and sleep quality. So once I discovered that and got to kind of get a whiff of it from a clinical standpoint, that's really what sort of drew my attraction to sleep, in the way that it affects us, and the way that treating people with sleep disorders can really, really be so rewarding, in a sense of just giving people back their quality of life.
No, it's interesting because even when I think about it, right, in the moment when you can't sleep, you're like, oh, this night is horrible. But the next day you get so busy in your work that you don't realize that it's not because your day is horrible, it's because your night was horrible. That's why your day is horrible. People become ignorant to that. So it's a very good point.
That's exactly what I mean.
So what should people do? What are good sleep habits, in general? And then we'll get deeper into things. But in general, what are some good sleep habits people should follow?
Sure. I would say the number one most important sleep habit is sleeping. We live in a sleep-deprived society, and most of us, close to all of us, are self-sleep deprivers. We're constantly curtailing the end of our sleep period by waking up too early. We're constantly pushing ourselves to the furthest extent by going to bed later and later. And then we end up with these, with chronic sleep insufficiency and chronic sleep debt, which can never be paid off. There's no such thing as paying
such an
sleep
interesting
debt.
thing is sleep debt. It's
Absolutely.
another debt that people have to worry about, right?
Absolutely. And it's a debt that unfortunately can never be paid back. Now, of course, when we're talking one or a few nights of partial or total sleep deprivation and then a recovery sleep period afterward on the weekend, that's one thing. But when we're talking about chronic sleep loss, you can never pay that sleep debt back. So I think that the most important sleep habit is, number one, to give your body the sleep that it dictates that it requires. And then apart from that, the sleep hygiene always comes up as sort of the topic of, ensuring that you have good sleep habits and a good nighttime or pre-bedtime routine. Things like making sure that your sleep environment is as sleep promoting of an environment as possible, that it's cool. Cool meaning there's a lot of controversy over what is cool. But for example, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, they recommend 65 to 70 degrees. And cool enough to be comfortable, but not too warm, because our body actually wants to get cold during sleep. In fact, the lowest temperature that the human body hits in a 24-hour period is during sleep. About 2 to 3 hours before you naturally awaken is when your body hits its lowest temperature. So your body wants to get cool during sleep, number one, keeping the room dark and making sure that there are no interferences in terms of our sleep. Your sleep is something that you want to protect. It's something that is fragile. It's labile. It can break. It can be broken. It can be intruded into. So ultimately ensuring that your room is cool, dark, quiet. I always tell people keep a timeless room. Timeless meaning that there are no cues to let you know what time it is.
Because no alarms.
Well, alarms are good to wake you up, but like a clock. Because what happens a lot when we experience, like, for example, a bout of sleep difficulty, we start clock watching. And once we start clock watching, then we start doing math. And then we start thinking to ourselves, okay, I've only been asleep for 30 minutes now, and I have to be awake in 2.5 hours. How the heck am I going to do this? This has been such a terrible week. Tomorrow is going to be so bad. The fear of the lack of sleep at the detriment that that's going to have on the following day's functioning. And then next thing you know, we get into this perpetual cycle of sleep anxiety and bedtime anxiety, which perpetuates more and more sleep difficulty. And it just becomes this vicious cycle that I'm sure hundreds of millions of people can identify with, that we all experience.
So when you say a cool sleep, now, is that relative to the time of year? Like if in the summer, you want your body to be cool, but in the winter, I would think the body would want to be relatively cool, but not the same amount of cool as the summertime, right? In the winter. So is it a relative temperature, or does it vary? Does it change between the seasons? Like, does your body regulate that?
No, I would say that between 65 to 70 degrees,
okay, so
regardless.
It's set, Okay, cool. So another question, because we were talking about math, what is the perfect amount of sleep?
Great question.
Yeah.
So, there really is no magic number in terms of duration of hours or a minimum duration that is, absolutely going to ensure that you're healthy as long as you get this amount. And, that doesn't really exist. Everyone's sleep requirement is individual. Some people require 8, some people require 7, millions require in between that. Now, most adults do require between 6 to 8 hours of nighttime sleep, which is where this whole 6 to 8 hour figure comes from. But it doesn't necessarily mean that as long as you sleep 6 hours, you're getting enough sleep. Because if your sleep requirement is closer to 8 hours and you're sleeping 6 or 6.5 hours, you're a sleep deprived person. So ultimately, the only way to know how much sleep you require, and this is, of course, not realistic in modern life, but it would be to give yourself a period of a good 2 weeks to sleep whenever you want, however long you want, sleep until you can't sleep anymore, sleep until you've slept off all your urge to sleep and you have no fatigue or sleepiness during the day. If you can sustain that for a period of, let's say, 2 weeks-ish or so, that's your individual sleep requirement, which, once again, everyone's is going to be different.
Alrighty. So we discussed basically the perfect time, but now I want to talk about something that that I am very interested in learning about, because I'm a very spiritual person. I like to meditate. I like to be mindful about my environment. Now, how does that tie in with sleep? Is it helpful? Does it promote good sleep to do all these things, or is it just a new age woo kind of thing? Like, hey, meditate and you'll get a good sleep.
Great question. No, I definitely don't think it's a new age voodoo thing. I think that ultimately mindfulness and meditative practices like meditation, these are things that, while we may not understand the exact underlying mechanism on why they improve certain aspects of health, I think that we can't argue that there is definitely benefit when it comes to these things. Plenty of people out there do these things, and it provides improvements in their mood, anxiety levels, vigilance, all kinds of different things, concentration, attention. So all that to say that in terms of sleep, there hasn't been a whole lot of data looking at this, but there's been some. One example, there was a big study that actually came out of UCLA many years ago, less than 10 years ago, looking at the effectiveness of Tai Chi in treating insomnia. Insomnia is the most common sleep disorder on planet Earth. It's what we define as any difficulty falling asleep or any difficulty staying asleep or both of those things. That's how we call what we refer to when we say insomnia. This study demonstrated that Tai Chi was just as effective in treating insomnia as the most effective treatment that exists for insomnia, which is what's called CBTI, or cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. So it's interesting that while, once again, an underlying mechanism cannot really be explained from a kind of physiologic standpoint, that using Tai Chi was just as effective as the most effective treatment for the most common sleep disorder in the world. So it goes to show you that there is definitely benefit. We just don't really understand it. But one thought is that practices like meditation, like Tai Chi, like mindfulness, what they might be doing is increasing our arousal threshold. Arousal threshold is a term that we kind of use loosely to describe the lightness or the depth of a person's sleep. Somebody who might feel like they're a very light sleeper and that, things wake them up very easily, that person might kind of describe their sleep threshold as being a low arousal threshold, meaning that it's easy for them to arouse from sleep. So the idea is that perhaps mindfulness, meditation, Tai Chi, things like this help to increase or raise a person's threshold for arousal and allow for a more profound and restorative sleep.
Cool. So going back to sleep habits real quick, is there, in your research and in your practice, do you find that there are difference in appropriate or the best sleep habits when it comes to like looking across genders and different ethnicities, or is it one size fits all for good sleep habits?
Very interesting question. As far as sleep habits, yes, I would say one size fits all. Now, age would probably play more into this than gender or ethnicity, for example, because our sleep requirements or our sleep needs, they vary significantly throughout the lifespan. When we're first born, we spend greater than 50% of the 24-hour period in the sleep state. We're sleeping 15, 16 hours as infants. And then all throughout childhood and adolescence and into young adulthood, that 16-hour sleep requirement somehow shrinks over 20 years to a 6 to 8 hour sleep requirement. So there's definitely a lot of changes in terms of sleep with regard to age-related changes in the brain and sleep physiology. But other than that, really, for adults, it is a one-size-fits-all.
That's very interesting because whenever you talk about most like healthcare disorders or issues, like you always think like, oh, gender and ethnicity play a big role, but sleep is one thing that we all have in common, that nothing changes across the board except for how old or young you are. So it's truly amazing how it connects us all in some way, right?
Well said. I love the way that you
problem
said
for all of us.
I love that you said
humankind,
that. And one thing I'll add to that, actually, that you made me think of in that comment is that a few years ago, when there was so much controversy about, what had happened with, for example, police brutality affecting the African American community, and you had the incident with George Floyd many years ago, a lot of people were obviously coming out and speaking during these times. And I remember that the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, which is our guiding academy in the sleep medicine world, they posted a statement during that whole period of time saying that sleep knows no color, sleep knows no race, sleep knows no ethnicity, it knows nothing. It's something that we all require and that we all do. And it's something that unites all creatures.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Yeah. So now we discuss what is the ideal sleep, and perfect sleep habits. But now I want to move into, let's say, well, realistically, no one, or at least very few people, get that perfect sleep. So what about those that don't? What are some short-term or even long-term illnesses that are very common from people who, don't get a good amount of sleep? And the reason for this question is maybe knowing of these things will deter them and try to tell them get better sleep.
Great question.
Yeah.
We are learning so much more about the effects on health of chronic sleep loss or chronically untreated sleep disorders like sleep apnea, like insomnia, for example. And what we're seeing really is that multiple systems in the body and multiple organ systems get affected by sleep loss and sleep issues. most concerning one probably being cardiovascular disease. We're learning so many different things about not only sleep apnea, which we've known for many, many years is associated with cardiovascular risk, but even just like we said, chronic sleep insufficiency or short sleep duration has been associated with increased mortality, increased likelihood of developing problems like high blood pressure, for example. So we're learning a lot about the effects of sleep on various systems. I would say that the two biggest systems in our body that get affected by sleep issues are, in my opinion, the two biggest health crises that we face in the world, which are cardiovascular health and mental health. And sleep issues and sleep disorders play directly and correlate directly with both of these things. So the fact that we underestimate that at times is something that I think is something that we need to do something about, and that's what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly right. Because I'm very interested in the world of sleep. I love to sleep so much. So, quick tangent. When it comes to sleep, is there any genetic reasons why people have less or more sleep, or they're inclined to sleep disorders because of genetic reasons?
What an excellent question. Yes, actually there is. The genetic component of certain sleep disorders, and it really depends on what kind of sleep disorder or what sleep issue we're talking about specifically. But for example, insomnia, once again, the most common sleep disorder in the world. It's not a genetic disease per se, but it's something that often runs in families. I mean, ultimately, a lot of sleep issues, including insomnia, have a heavy behavioral component to them. And where do we learn our behaviors, right? The environment that we grew up in and the people that we grew up in. So you'll often see things like insomnia run in families. Even restless leg syndrome very often runs in families. Or people who have circadian rhythm issues, like, for example, people who are night owls classically. Not that being a night owl is a sleep disorder, but it's a problem if you need to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and you're a night owl who never sleeps before 2 a.m., for example. Even something like that very often runs in families in terms of circadian preference of evening versus day. So all that to say that many sleep issues have a genetic component to them, even though they're not necessarily inherited genetic diseases.
Okay, cool. So like kind of, if I'm understanding this correctly, the circadian rhythm is basically our internal clock. So basically, someone who works night shifts has a flipped circadian rhythm than someone who works an 8 to 5.
Correct. That's right. That's one example of a circadian issue. Now, being a shift worker is in and of itself not a problem. I mean, obviously, many people are shift workers, and especially if they're able to maintain good sleep health, and fit that into this shift work schedule such that they're able to acclimate to being a shift worker, and now they're sleeping during the day and they're doing just fine. But it is very common for shift workers to struggle either with sleeping during the daytime or with being totally alert during their night shift. And in those cases, we call that shift work disorder, which is a type of circadian rhythm disorder, and we have different treatments and solutions for that.
I see. Now, something that we've talked about in the past, outside of this podcast, REM versus non-REM sleep. So REM, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, rapid eye movement, non-REM is non-rapid eye movement. So what exactly is REM and non-REM?
We need a separate podcast now. No?
Briefly.
Yes, of course. So there are 4 stages of sleep. There's non-REM 1, non-REM 2, non-REM 3, and REM. Notice how sleep is literally differentiated or delineated between what is REM and what is not REM. It's because, number one, the physiology of REM sleep is very unique and very different from the rest of the stages of sleep. And not to mention certain diseases or certain sleep disorders exclusively affect REM sleep versus non-REM sleep. And vice versa is true as well. So not to get too sciencey with it, during rapid eye movement sleep, which is a very unique stage of sleep, we spend about 10 to 20% of our nighttime sleep in that stage. And essentially what happens during that stage is a few things. Number one, that's the stage of sleep that we dream, right? So vivid imagery is a big part of that. Additionally, our muscles are typically paralyzed during that stage of sleep and only during that stage of sleep. Can you imagine what would happen if our muscles were not paralyzed at a time in which we were having nightmares and dreams? What would happen?
Oh, the people next to you would be waking up bruised and...
That's exactly correct. Which actually that happens, and because this represents there is a sleep disorder in which that paralysis that's supposed to happen is not functioning properly. So now the person is acting their dreams out and hurting themselves and hurting their bed partner, and it's awful. But that's essentially these are just some examples of how different REM sleep is from the other stages of sleep. paralysis, vivid imagery, a lot of the brain's recovery and sort of taking out the trash, as we call it, and cleaning of plaques from the brain occur during this stage of sleep. So that's REM sleep. And there are certain disorders, like we said, or certain sleep issues or sleep disease, sleep-related problems that exclusively affect REM sleep. One example is narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is a neurologic sleep disorder where a person constantly feels sleepy and has difficulty maintaining wakefulness during the daytime. And once again, not to get too sciencey with it, a lot of the problem in that condition is because their REM sleep is very unstable. So that's that. And then in terms of non-REM sleep, things like sleepwalking, sleep terrors, which in a child are usually benign and harmless, and kids just outgrow these
Is it
things.
when they like jitter in their sleep? Are those terrors, or is it like
Somewhat like that. Sleep
Okay.
terrors are essentially when you have a person who just suddenly rises from sleep, screaming, sobbing hysterically, looking like they're having an absolute nightmare, but they're actually not having a dream or a nightmare at all. They just look like they're in an absolute state of terror. They're not really fully asleep, but they've not really fully awakened yet. And that's a classic
they're in
sleep
limbo.
terror. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
They're in what's called a state of arousal, which is what we call that sort of tangential space between sleep and wakefulness. So things like sleep terrors, or like we said, sleepwalking. Sleepwalking also occurs during non-REM sleep, which is why the sleepwalker doesn't really recall what they did at nighttime or where they walked. They'll very often wake up and find, the dryer's ice cream on the kitchen counter and not necessarily know how it got there, or Doritos bag is in their bed. Sleep eating is very common in sleepwalkers. And that, once again, represents, because it's not occurring in association with a dream, really what that represents is a person who is just exhibiting this automatic behavior that they usually do during the daytime, walking, eating, talking, even sexual activity, except that the brain is unable to kind of separate it out. And so it's occurring during this, once again, state of arousal. I don't want to get too complicated.
That
or
reminds me
technical
of
with it.
the sleep eating. That reminds me of someone I knew who wake up in the middle of the night and just put a bunch of M&Ms in their mouth and then just like go back to sleep. That's an interesting way to, yeah.
At least it was something edible. You
Yeah,
should
yeah.
see some of the sleep eaters that I see in my clinic.
So there's no way of for us to control when we enter REM and non-REM, is there?
That is correct. However, the only argument to that would be if you were to sleep deprive yourself. See, when we sleep deprive ourselves and then we catch up on sleep after that, usually we end up catching up on our REM sleep first, or our brain tries to catch up for our REM sleep first because it has this affinity towards REM sleep in the state of sleep deprivation, where it gets hungrier our brain is hungrier for REM sleep when we're starved of sleep. So to answer your question, the only way that you can enter REM sleep earlier or make that one change to your sleep would be to sleep deprive yourself, which is not recommended, of course.
Oh yeah. Well, it's funny that kind of reminds me of an analogy, and please don't take my advice when I say this, but just like our dreams are hard to achieve in real life, you have to go through a lot of shit to get there. So sleep deprive yourself if you want to keep dreaming.
That's true. That is
Yeah.
true.
Now, I know you mentioned insomnia before, but I've also heard of something called parasomnia and hypersomnia. Are these categories, insomnia, parasomnia, hypersomnia, are these categories of sleep disorders? And if you could briefly touch upon.
Absolutely, yes. Those are all categories of sleep disorders. So the parasomnias are a category of sleep disorders that represent complex and abnormal movements during sleep. So sleepwalking is an example of a parasomnia of non-REM sleep. Dream enactment behavior, or acting your dreams out physically, is a parasomnia of REM sleep because it's in association with dreams. So parasomnia is, again, it just refers to any one of these, this what falls under this category of complex and abnormal behaviors during sleep. And then when we say hypersomnia, we're talking about a category of sleep disorders that are characterized by hypersomnolence or excessive sleepiness, persistently excessive sleepiness. The most common or well-known of the hypersomnias is narcolepsy, which is, once again, a neurologic sleep disorder characterized by difficulty maintaining wakefulness and alertness during the daytime. It's not somebody who drops their face into a chocolate cake mid-sentence, even though that's what the television
That's what I would
always
think,
paints
right? Yeah,
narcolepsy
when
to
you're
be.
when you're driving, you're
Just dropping, exactly.
exactly.
Now, of course, there are people who have narcolepsy who are that severe in terms of their symptoms, such that they will all of a sudden fall asleep in the middle of an activity requiring vigilance or attention. But there are many people with narcolepsy who that doesn't happen to them, but they just feel sleepy all the time and are constantly fighting sleepiness using energy drinks, coffee, certain stimulants. So it can be a serious, serious problem. And it's something that, like we said, it represents the media's portrayal of something like narcolepsy. Once again, it really speaks to the under recognition and under diagnosis of sleep disorders as a whole. unfortunately.
So me wanting to sleep more than 10 hours isn't qualified as a hypersomnia, is it?
No.
Oh, okay, because I love to sleep. I can sleep for 14 hours if I need to. Just knock out anywhere.
No, we have, well,
Well, no.
maybe we should talk after this. No, I'm just kidding.
Willingly knock out everywhere.
Of course,
Anywhere.
of course.
Yeah. Um, uh, so sleep paralysis, I want to get into that because I think I've experienced it once where I've had a dream and then I thought I was locked in place. The only thing that worked was my eyes that would open, or we have a common friend who also had experienced this, and his was even traumatic because he was under the covers. So, like in the stages like that, like how can a person get out of that, or what's the best thing to do if you have sleep paralysis?
So sleep paralysis, first of all, what is sleep paralysis? Sleep paralysis is essentially, you can think of it in an abstract way as when the brain kind of starts to put one step out into wakefulness while its other foot is still in sleep. So it's kind of like this very brief transient phenomena that happens as a person is either just entering sleep or just exiting sleep.
Okay.
And essentially, the paralysis. Why the paralysis? Because like we were just talking about a minute ago, one of the things that happens during rapid eye movement sleep is our muscles get paralyzed. And when we are sleep deprived, or we're under very significant stress or having like a significant stressor in our life, these are the more common causes of sleep paralysis. What happens is this paralysis mechanism that's supposed to occur exclusively during REM sleep ends up spilling outward or leaking out into the first moment of wakefulness while the brain has woken up. So this is why the person feels like their muscles are paralyzed, because they were in REM sleep. But the brain has woken up. And that's why very often people hallucinate when they have an episode of sleep paralysis, and they'll see a demon in the room, or they'll see a shadow walking around, or figures or spiders on the wall, or it might even just be a sensory thing where they feel like there's a presence in the room in that moment and they get scared. Because once again, REM sleep, vivid imagery, muscle paralysis. So all that starts to leak into that first moment of wakefulness in the form of sleep paralysis.
I feel like sleep specialists probably kill horror movies, right? Because like you're like, oh, this is just a night terror. Oh, it's just sleep paralysis. There's nothing there. Okay, so another issue that I've read a lot about, and I've actually had people in my family experience this, including one of my parents and my aunts, like restless leg syndrome, or even my grandfather. Like he would be sleeping at night, and then he would just like, I had to wake up, like I felt I couldn't feel my legs, and I just had to move around. And so, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So restless leg syndrome is a very, very common thing, and it can be very, very annoying. Essentially, what restless leg syndrome is an uncomfortable feeling in the person's legs that occurs exclusively or predominantly at nighttime when they're at rest, such as if they're sitting on the couch at night watching TV, or if they're in bed trying to sleep and they're laying down. And it's essentially a non-painful, uncomfortable urge to want to just keep on moving the leg around. And it feels a little bit better, or you get some relief when you move or you stretch your leg or you get up and walk around. But then when you're back at rest, it comes right back. So it's this kind of really annoying, kind of creepy, crawly feeling that a person struggles with at nighttime. Now, I can tell you, it's extremely common, and most people eventually just shake the sensation off and get to sleep. But there's a number of people who experience symptoms of restless legs so badly that it keeps them up for hours at a time, and it can really, really destroy their sleep and make it really difficult for them to sleep and be a serious problem for them during the daytime as well. Of course.
And I don't know if you can answer this, but I know for my grandfather, they kind of connected this like neuropathy, like maybe he was having some nerve issues, and so they connected to that. So you never know unless you have a sleep study, right?
That's a great question. Well, restless leg syndrome, because it's happening during wakefulness, it's not necessarily anything that you can identify on a sleep study. However, you brought up a really good point in which it can be more complicated or more difficult to sort of tease out what's a restless leg from somebody who has neuropathy of their legs, or even leg cramps at nighttime. But usually things like leg cramps and neuropathy have more of a painful or a kind of, achy quality to them, as opposed to restless leg, which doesn't really hurt. It's just really, really irritating and annoying. But I can tell you that very commonly it can co-occur with those things and can be very difficult to tease it out.
Okay. Leg cramps, do they happen commonly as a sleep issue? Like, and is there a treatment for it that's like non-medical or
Great question.
or non-medicinal?
Nocturnal leg cramps are extremely common and unfortunately poorly studied in terms of different remedies. Now, there's been some anecdotal data to suggest that vitamin E and magnesium can be particularly helpful with nocturnal leg cramps, and I will suggest that patients try that, even though there's no real solid evidence to show that it's beneficial. But I can tell you that a lot of people benefit with just those regular over-the-counter remedies. And number two, Adequate hydration during the daytime. I mean, we're using our legs all day. We're walking around. We're bearing most of the weight of our upper body on our legs at night, throughout the daytime. So just ensuring that those muscles that are being worked so much and used so much during the daytime are well hydrated is something that can also help with nocturnal leg cramps.
Cool. So thank you for breaking down insomnia, parasomnia, and hypersomnia and the associated disorders with them. I want to move on to something that is major on both the severity scale and as a nuisance, and that's snoring, or technically sleep apnea, right? Sleep apnea is associated with snoring.
It is associated with snoring, that's right.
Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about that and how much of a problem it is? Because a lot of people have sleep apnea. They're not even aware of it. Like, you can even hear on some podcasts, like one of the famous ones, Joe Rogan, he's on a plane with a guy and the guy is snoring and he wakes up like choking and he's like, dude, you need to go get a sleep study. I think you have sleep apnea. And people don't even know. They're just like, oh, I'm just a snorer.
Yeah. It's a great question. And I can tell you the first thing I'd want to kind of put out there in response to that is that not all that snores is sleep apnea, and not all that sleep apnea snores. Now, we do see snoring as a very, very common thing in sleep apnea, and it's one of the most easy giveaways that a person may have sleep apnea. But once again, not everyone who snores has sleep apnea. Snoring can come from having a structural issue in the nose or having bad allergies, or it can come from just having a small throat and a thick tongue, for example. But sleep apnea is different in the sense that sleep apnea is a throat issue, and it's essentially when the throat keeps on getting blocked throughout the nighttime sleep by the person's own tongue and throat muscles. So essentially these structures that are in our throat that get really lazy and relax when we go to sleep and start to sag and droop into our airway space. In people with sleep apnea, it sags and droops into the airway space to the point that it intermittently and periodically throughout the night blocks the airway space and blocks the breathing pipe. The problem with that is, apart from being disruptive to sleep, whether the person even realizes it or not, because we don't know what's going on when our brain is in and out of sleep in the middle of the night. But apart from being disruptive to sleep without even being noticed by many people, is that every time your throat muscles and tongue block your airway for a few seconds, your oxygen level comes down. And when your oxygen level comes down, your body doesn't like that. It reacts to that. It thinks that there's an emergency. So your heart starts to get a little bit stressed. Your blood pressure will go up a little bit. There will even be the release of inflammatory factors into the bloodstream. So this is how sensitive our body is to oxygen levels, that even just brief pockets of a few seconds at a time throughout one night's sleep causes this sort of insult diffusely to the body. And we sleep every single night. So if we sleep every single night, and that represents 20 to 30% of our lifetime spent in the sleep state, in a state where our oxygen level is fluctuating and unstable, our heart keeps on getting stressed, our blood pressure is a little bit erratic and fluctuates, well, it's no wonder over time sleep apnea turns into high blood pressure, stroke, and heart disease. Not in the middle of the night, it's going to cause a heart attack or a stroke. I mean, it may, not directly at least, but it just increases the risk of those things over time as a result of just insulting the cardiovascular system every night.
Yeah. So I work with a lot of cardiologists and mostly electrophysiologists. And, something I always hear floating around is AFib. And is that something that's closely tied with sleep apnea?
Absolutely. What a great question. What an important question. So atrial fibrillation, it is an abnormal heart rhythm that essentially puts a person at risk for a multitude of cardiovascular events, most concerning stroke, which can definitely happen in people who have untreated atrial fibrillation or uncontrolled atrial fibrillation. The relationship between atrial fibrillation and sleep apnea is such that there was a huge study that came out about 10 years ago, actually, with about 6,000 subjects that showed that people who had atrial fibrillation and treated sleep apnea, compared to people who had atrial fibrillation and untreated sleep apnea, the people who had treated sleep apnea had a 60% less recurrence of atrial fibrillation following treatment for atrial fibrillation. In other words, when people who had this abnormal heart rhythm, atrial fibrillation, were treated and put into a normal heart rhythm, the chance of them going back into atrial fibrillation was 60% less when their sleep apnea was treated. So it is a very well-known correlation, a well-known association. It's been studied, and we see it all the time, which is why cardiac electrophysiologists very commonly refer to us as sleep physicians to ensure that these patients are screened and treated for sleep apnea. Last thing you want is to be treated for an abnormal heart rhythm and then just keep going right back into it because your sleep apnea is untreated. And it makes sense because, once again, if we are asleep every single night and our oxygen level at night is unstable and this keeps on agitating the heart, well, how much agitation can the heart really take before it goes into an unstable rhythm?
Yeah, so it's good to know that because, I have family members who diagnosed with AFib, but they've never really, they ask you like, oh, do you snore at night? Do you have difficulty sleeping? But shouldn't it be standard like, oh, just suggest a sleep study regardless, just to make sure? Is that appropriate?
I think so. I
Okay.
agree with you 100%. It's not, unfortunately, it's not a task force recommendation for all people with atrial fibrillation, but it really ought to be. I agree with you.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Moving on. So we talked a lot of science, but now I want to address some questions that might affect, like the day-to-day person who's not a clinician or just has some of these issues. What are the impacts of like intoxicants, psychedelics, and other controlled substances on sleep overall? Like some people say, like, oh, when I get drunk, I have the best sleep of my life, or when I'm high, like I sleep really well. So what is the case with that?
Great question. Alcohol in particular, just because it's so well studied, alcohol has multiple detriments on sleep. Number one, you notice your friends snore much more when they drink, right?
Yeah.
The reason is because alcohol also kind of allows or facilitates this sort of relaxation of the tongue and muscles in the throat, such that it ends up narrowing your throat and causing snoring. Well, we were just talking about how sleep apnea, the whole problem is that the person's tongue and throat muscles and structures are relaxing to the point of periodically blocking the airway. Now imagine on top of that, you pour alcohol. Well, on a night that a person drinks, especially close to bedtime, if they have sleep apnea, they're going to have way more difficulty breathing on a night like that, more snoring, more episodes of apnea, more drops in oxygen, meaning more cumulative time with their oxygen low during sleep. And all of that is, of course, bad. Even in a person who doesn't actually have sleep apnea at baseline and drinks a ton of alcohol on a night, on that night, they actually might sleep like someone with sleep apnea just because of how relaxed those structures are, blocking their airway all throughout the nighttime. So breathing is the one detriment that alcohol can have on sleep. Another detriment that alcohol has on sleep is on sleep staging, or what the brain is trying to do. So as we fall asleep, or once we fall asleep, like as you know, we sleep in cycles from light, intermediate to deep, and then we're cycling through those all night. In the presence of alcohol, alcohol is a very well-known and a potent REM sleep suppressant. So in the presence of alcohol, particularly for that first half of the night, which is those first 3-4 hours when alcohol's active metabolites are in the body, what happens is you have kind of this suppression effect where the person practically gets no rapid eye movement sleep in the first half of the night. But as the alcohol is wearing off halfway into sleep, all of a sudden they have this rebound effect where they get tons of rapid eye movement sleep, and all kind of just rushing into their brain in the second half of the sleep period. And that's just not the way our body likes to sleep, or our brain likes to sleep. It likes to sleep, like we said, in cycles, rather than having it light for the first half, and then all of a sudden drop into deep and just be fragmented and structurally unstable.
So it's appropriate to then have this understanding that alcoholics have terrible sleep.
That is correct.
They're sleep deprived.
That is absolutely correct. Yes.
Yeah.
That's as they do with many other health problems. Yeah.
So has any other research done with other controlled substances, or mainly alcohol? Or
Yeah. There have been some really small studies looking at cannabis and its effect on not only sleep or falling asleep, but also they've even looked at cannabis in terms of its effect on breathing and sleep apnea. Nothing really conclusive or really solid has come out of any of that to actually make a clinical recommendation for or against any of these things. But there are plenty of people out there who, within reason, might use something like cannabis or another over-the-counter supplement, for example, to try to help facilitate falling asleep, which I can say, if the person is doing it in a safe way and they're doing it with clinical supervision, ideally, that's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
But other than that, we don't really have a whole lot of rock solid data looking at these alternatives.
When we're talking about mental health issues, depression comes to mind, right? Depressed people like to sleep a lot, and sometimes, people who are escapist tendency, first thing you do is, I'm just going to go to sleep, and that can also lead to depression. Can you talk a little about that, the correlation of sleep and depression, and even other mental health issues?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Again, this requires a separate podcast, but the sleep and mental health overlap is really tremendous, and we can't deny that, because we all know how we feel in terms of our mental state just from one night of partial or total sleep deprivation. The way that we are that day, that's not really representative of how we feel and how we normally are, right? So I'll say that very often nighttime sleep issues like insomnia, difficulty falling asleep, or waking up and having difficulty getting back to sleep, very often mental health is really what's underneath all of that, in such that in many people who have anxiety disorders or mood disorders like major depression, very often the sleep issue kind of behaves like a symptom of that underlying problem. you made a really good point about depression specifically is very commonly associated with significant daytime sleepiness. In fact, a lot of people who come and see me who I'm evaluating for possible disorders or hypersomnia disorders like narcolepsy, very often all the testing comes back normal, and we determine that really it was just the very severe depression the person was experiencing that was causing them to feel so sleepy during the daytime and constantly wanting to nap. Yeah. So that's just one example. And then, like we said, nighttime sleep issues, rumination, catastrophizing, anxiety, things that at nighttime very commonly interfere with sleep. These are all representations of our mental health. So mental health or inadequately treated or uncontrolled mental health issues can most certainly impact nocturnal sleep and daytime energy, and both, and can be really difficult sometimes to tease out from actual sleep disorders. So.
Talking about like taking, what about naps? Like people take a lot of naps. Is that beneficial to their sleep habits, or does that promote ideal sleep, taking little naps in between, or people should avoid that and just take their 8 hours at night if they can?
That's a great question. I think that when we're talking about naps, it's first important to define what a nap is. Sleeping for 3 or 4 hours in the middle of the daytime, that's not really a nap. The question becomes, why are you needing 3 to 4 hours of sleep during the daytime? Was there a massive sleep insufficiency the night before or sleep deprivation? Or did you actually sleep 8 hours and still require a 3 or 4 hour nap in the middle of the day? Because a lot of people with the sleep disorders that we treat, that's how they present very often. So with that said, defining a nap, if somebody can nap for 10 or 20 minutes during the daytime and it helps them get through the rest of their day, it doesn't interfere with their ability to carry out what they need to do during the daytime. It doesn't impact their nighttime sleep at all, and they're getting sufficient nighttime sleep and they otherwise feel good, I don't identify a problem with the person who's napping like that. But a person who's constantly needing the nap, a person who needs to leave the office and go to the car a couple times to be able to sleep off some sleepiness that's otherwise interfering with their ability to stay alert and awake in front of their computer screen, well, that's not a nap anymore. This is somebody who is fighting sleepiness during the daytime, and that warrants investigation and a diagnostic workup.
I see. Sleep, can sleep ever be considered addictive? Like people are addicted to sleeping, or is that?
That's an I've never heard that question before. That's such an interesting question.
I mean, I feel like I am addicted to sleeping. I'm like, if someone offers me a nice comfy bed, sure, I'll take a nap.
We really should talk after this.
Yeah. Alrighty. Melatonin and FDA regulation. I know we had a brief conversation about this beforehand, but when you go around and you don't really see, like, you go to the grocery store, you'll see like, oh, this brand has melatonin this many milligrams and this many milligrams. Like, is there any kind of recommendation, or overall is melatonin like a gimmick, or does it actually work?
Great question. Yeah. Such a good question. First of all, you brought up a really good point. Supplements like melatonin are very poorly regulated. So even one bottle of melatonin to the next, you don't necessarily know what you're getting. And it's not like this is something that's going to be consistent. All kinds of different formulations of melatonin exist, everything from time release, extended release, instant release, liquid, oral solution, chewable tablets, capsules. So ultimately, they are poorly regulated, these supplements. But there are a few clinical uses, scientific uses of melatonin where melatonin does consistently provide benefit, but it's just not for the reason that it's being marketed and sold over the counter for, which is just to help you fall asleep or to treat insomnia per se. It's never been really demonstrated to be an effective remedy for that specific problem of difficulty falling asleep. Now, with that said, there are plenty of people out there that take melatonin and it does help them fall asleep because some people get drowsy with it. You can call it a placebo, but for some people, it does make them drowsy, does help them fall asleep, in which case they're lucky as far as I'm concerned, because that's not what everybody experiences with melatonin. But when we actually prescribe melatonin for an actual clinical or for scientific use, it's usually for one of two situations. Number one, it is to sway a person's circadian rhythm, because melatonin, depending on how strategically you time it during what time of day you take it, you can actually delay your natural sleep schedule or advance your natural sleep schedule depending on which is desired. And then another situation in which we'll actually scientifically use melatonin is going back to what we were talking about for people who have dream enactment behavior. So that's a sleep disorder called REM sleep behavior disorder, which is characterized by a person who violently acts their dreams out, very often injures themselves, injures their bed partner. It happens all the time. I see people every day bringing their wives in with a black eye or a bruise, or they'll have a crack on their head because they jumped out of bed or fell out of bed and hit their head on the floor. So in people who do these really bizarre, violent dream enactment behaviors, melatonin has this kind of unique muscle relaxant property to it. You can think of it. And even the most violent dream enacting people, when they take melatonin at the right dose at nighttime, it will actually control those movements and muscle movements so that they don't hurt themselves. But outside of circadian rhythm and dream enactment behavior, we don't really have much of a scientific use of melatonin in the clinical sleep world.
I see.
If it helps the person sleep, great, but that's not going to be my evidence-based recommendation to help you fall asleep.
And to be honest, I don't even think the people who market it know, because they're marketing it as a fix-all drug for sleep or a fix-all supplement for sleep, and they don't even know what it's exactly for, right? So it's good to clear that point for our viewers. So, as we close things out, what is a summary of quick remedial measures that our viewers can use even tonight to go to sleep?
Yeah, great question. I would say this. In general, there's a reason that children sleep like rock stars, right? Kids don't experience insomnia. Kids are not in bed thinking about the war on the other side of the world and the struggles and so on and so forth. Not only because they don't obviously have to think about those things, they're children, but because of one big thing, which is that in the brain of a child, bed and sleep are synonymous. It's a conditioned association. These two things are synonymous for one another. And that's why you'll never catch a kid in bed doing anything but sleeping. And this association, this perfect conditioning of associating the bed and sleep and having that as this, conditioned thing in our head is what we lose as we become adults, especially adults with sleep issues. So my answer to your question about what can we do, simple things that we can do at nighttime, in addition to having just good sleep hygiene and good sleep habits, is really trying to limit our time in bed to time asleep as much as possible. And avoiding those prolonged windows of wakefulness in bed where we are thinking about stressful things, where we are ruminating, where we are feeling things like anxiety, where we are catastrophizing. These are the things that not only interfere with sleep, but the more and more we do these things in bed, well, now our bed is going to become conditioned with those things, with wakefulness, with alertness, with hyperarousal, with vigilance, with feeling activated in the location and the environment that we should not be feeling any of those things and that we should be sleeping. So limit time in bed to time asleep as much as possible, whether that means in the beginning of the night, delaying your bedtime to match when you feel sleepy as opposed to going to bed too early. And if in the middle of the night unable to fall back asleep after an awakening, once again, having a strategy to exit that space and return when you feel more sleepy. And of course, in that meantime, not doing things that are going to activate us or wake us up in the meantime. But these are just little pieces of some of the things that we recommend as sleep physicians. These are not intended to be taken as end-all solutions to all sleep issues. But once again, the overarching point is try to limit time in bed at night to time asleep as much as possible.
Yeah, so no phone use, no reading a book, just bed is for sleep.
Yeah, no phone, no book, no wakefulness, really. And this is a misconception. A lot of people think that the enemy is devices.
Yeah.
The enemy is not devices. The enemy is wakefulness, alertness in the place that you're not supposed to be feeling those things. How can your body learn to re-enhance the association between bed and sleep if you're using it for things other than sleep?
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. Well, Sam, we learned a lot from you today. Your expertise is amazing when it comes to sleep. But what captures this all is the fact that you had this journey of starting somewhere like in a creative field, film, and crossing those difficult obstacles and making your way into the world of medicine, and staying passionate throughout, staying caring throughout, and doing a lot for your patients and for the world of sleep. Because obviously, if you had a lot to contribute, that's why you're now the current president of the Sleep Society, California Sleep Society. So I'm truly grateful that you were my first guest because you have so many accomplishments. And so thank you so much for being our inaugural guest at the Openly Human Show. And it was great talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate your words. Thank you.